Okay, this is a big one. So get comfy, grab a tea, and join me for Fitting Dress Patterns and Blocks, Part 2. If you haven't watched Part 1 yet, click on the card to watch it first. Welcome back. Now it's time to toile your block or pattern in calico or muslin. It should fit at the bust, waist, and hip, so you should be able to get on your body or mannequin quite easily. However, there are so many other body measurements we need to take into account. And yes, we could use flat pattern cutting to do this. Here is the measurement chart I use when I take a private client's measurements. So you can see there are lots of other measurements to find the bust height, shoulder depth. But in the end, you will always need to toile your block or pattern, at least once. The body just has so many curves and we're all different. Each side of our body is different. So the quickest way is to do what we're doing now. So grade the pattern or block at the key points, bust, waist, and hip, and then toile it and fit it as a toile. Fitting as a toile also lets you see how the pattern and block is looking on your body and how it feels, which is really important. So I've cut my weird pattern in calico, and you can see I've just pinned the seams together. I like to pin the seams, I just find it easy to change, but if you want to sew them, do that. I've also marked my center front, waist, and center back seams. You don't need to do this unless you're only going to toile half your pattern. I've done it because one side's bigger and one side's smaller, and if I don't mark it exactly on the center front, obviously it will shift and become like sort of an average size. So just for my demonstration, I'm going to pin it directly on the center front, and I'll be putting it on the mannequin with the seams facing outwards so I can change it really easily. And whether you pin or sew, I would really recommend doing this. It's much easier to make changes when you can access the seams really easily. And I will show you how to do a sleeve, but I find it easier to perfect. We'll get the front and back armhole looking great first, then put the sleeve on. It's just easier to look at the shoulder and the underarm seam, that kind of thing. So I will put the sleeve on later. Okay, it's on. Just had a quick look at it, and I thought I was going to have more issues than this given I did that sort of size mix with the patterns, but I've still got some things to show you, and the rest of them I'll just add in. So now I'm going to show you how to fit the key parts of the body, and we're going to work from the bottom to the top. I start with the bottom because I find that the area below the hip is often a big problem area, and it will affect your ability to fit the surrounding areas. And it's always best to fit one section at a time. Think of it like a domino effect. So you fix one area, it will affect the surrounding areas too, and it may fix some of your issues. So what we're looking for are areas that are tight and baggy. Areas that are tight will have these sort of stretch lines going across the fabric. That is because the fabric is being stretched across the area. It's too small. And often these lines will point to where the problem is or where you need to change it, which is quite handy. The baggy areas, like on the neck here, they also kind of have a direction to them, but the fabric will look like it's sagging. There'll be excess. In this video, I'll be showing you how to add and subtract fabric to make these lines go away. And sometimes it's just simple as unpinning a seam and smoothing the fabric into it and then redrawing the seam. Other times you've got to hack into your toile, cut it open, add some fabric, or use the darts at pivot points, but more on that later. The most important thing about fitting, and sort of rule number one, is you don't want to overfit. You still need to be able to move. So while you're fitting it, move your arms, try and sit down. Make sure you can do everything you want to do when you're wearing this dress. You do not want to overfit it. Oh, and before we get started, I've also put timestamps of each body location in the description below. So if you want to jump to the area that you need, feel free to do that. Remember what I said about when you fix one area, it can affect the surrounding ones. So if you fix something and feel like it's still looking off from the surrounding areas, watch those sections too. So now let's get started with the biggest problem you're likely to have. If you're making this block or pattern for yourself, you might notice the toile is pulling and it's tight across the body below the hip. This is because the widest point on most people isn't at the hip. It's actually close to the crotch or upper thigh here. And you won't just see your dress stretching, it'll also be trying to ride up because it doesn't fit this point, so your body is trying to like find somewhere with more circumference. And if your dress has a vent, or maybe you remember wearing a fitted dress or skirt that has a vent, your body will keep riding up until it finds that vent. So the vent can splay open and then it'll give it more circumference. And if you think back to maybe wearing a fitted dress at a party and you're at the beginning of the night, you're trying to like shimmy it down to get it to fit, and by the end of the night you've kind of given up on it and moving the dance floor and it's riding up. This is the widest point. And it's not just you, it's pretty much everyone. Most people, the widest part of their body is at below the hip. However, we make patterns so that the hip is the widest point and then it goes straight down for a fitted style. So to stop this from happening, all you have to do is unpin the side seam on both the front and back, and then you just look where the stretch lines are starting. So maybe they'll start at the top hip, or maybe even the waist or the hip. So just start unpinning where the stretch lines start, and the biggest stretch line will obviously be at the widest point. So unpin from the stretch lines all the way down to the hem, and then just let the fabric lay flat, and then repin the side seam here. So the side seam will probably now be somewhere out here. That's why it's really important to have a 2 centimeter seam allowance, or maybe even more if you know your widest point is a lot bigger than your hip. So then once you've repinned the seam and everything's lying flat and there's no stretch lines, all you do is just redraw the side seam with a pen or marker. When you go to amend your pattern, you'll notice that the side seam line you've drawn goes out below the hip. When you redraw the line, make sure it's nice and smooth, and if you need to add a bit to the hip to make the line smooth, don't worry. After you mark the widest point, the side seam should then go straight down to the hem. You can also check the measurement is correct by measuring your own body. So just find your widest point. Mine's sort of around here, just like at my crotch. And just measure your own body. Make sure you're doing it horizontal. So do it in front of a mirror or a camera like I am. And then take that measurement. So mine's like 97. And check your pattern the same measurement. And you also can check the depth of your widest point. So just get the waist here, measure down to your widest point, and you can check that you've got the same location on your pattern. And also remember that if you've added ease to the hip, add the same amount of ease to your widest point too. If your toile is loose below the waist here, it just means that the waistline on your pattern is higher than on your body. So you just need to lengthen the pattern. If we were doing this with flat pattern cutting, we'd slash and spread across a block somewhere between the bust and waistline and spread it to the desired amount. Also, when you're picking your slash and spread locations, try and find somewhere kind of neutral, so not too close to a bust dart or any sort of style lines, somewhere where not too much is happening on the pattern. But since we create a toile, all you need to do is just pin out the excess of the side seam here. Once you pin that out and it's all looking good, you can draw over the side seam, and you can also draw your new waistline here. So the new waistline will be lower now than it was on the original pattern. Now if your toile is tight below the waist, so there are stretch lines going across here, or the toile is riding up, it means that the waistline on your pattern is lower than what you need for your body. If we were flat pattern making, we'd overlap rather than spread by the desired amount, so the waistline moves up, and we'd redraw the side seam so it's nice and smooth. But on the toile, all we need to do is just release the seams here, so take out the pins and just let the fabric sit smoothly and then just repin it. So to adjust the waist, all we're doing is just changing the side seams here. So either taking them in or out to add or subtract fabric. And once you're happy and the fabric's sitting really nicely, just grab a pen or marker and just draw over your new side seam lines. And you can also draw your new waist seam. You might also be wondering why the slash and spread lines on the back are horizontal and straight, while the slash lines on the front are curved. When you're lengthening or shortening a pattern across the body, it's important to add the same amount all the way across, whether it's between the waist and the hip, or the waist and the bust, or across the chest here. And I'll get to why it's important to do the same amount in a second. But do yourself a favour and make sure when you pin out the excess or add fabric in, that you do it horizontally. It's just much easier when you create your pattern if you do horizontal slash lines, so then you're adding or subtracting vertically. If you start pinning at diagonal lines, you'll then be spreading your pattern at an angle, and you can run the risk of inadvertently putting in more problems and creating more fit issues. So pin the same amount horizontally across your toile. So now that you know that you have to make these changes horizontally across the piece, why is the front not horizontal? Well, it actually is. Look at the bust and waist lines on the back and front. On your body, they're straight right, but the dart on the front warps the bust and waist lines. If I close the dart, these lines will be straight, but obviously the paper pattern needs to be flat. The dart has to open, or when the dart is open, the line swings up. So when you pin horizontally on your toile, don't worry if the lines you marked then warp or bend when you open the dart and lie the toile flat to create your pattern. Oh, and while we're looking just below the waist here, It's good to check your top hip, which is about 10 centimeters down from the waist. Just check if this area is looking good. So if it's got a bit of excess along the side seam, just pin it out. If it's looking a bit tight, you can just release the seams and add some more fabric in. Just check if these side seams are looking really nice. Now, if your pattern doesn't have a waist seam, you'll notice that there's a bit of excess around here. And it shows up more, or quite a lot in calico, but I want you to leave this alone. Don't touch it. This is what happens when you have a block or a pattern without a waist seam. Our sides is just longer than the center front here, so there's always a bit of excess in the middle. You can see the excess really clearly here when you combine a bodice and skirt block to make a torso block. Now, we wouldn't leave that much excess. It's all about compromise. So the side seam is a little shorter than it wants to be, but we don't have as much excess. And if you have a waist seam, you can remove all this excess, because essentially you have a bodice and skirt pattern, and when you sew them together, it's a dress. Good news is this excess shows up a lot more in calico. It's not as forgiving. So in your final fabric, it'll look a lot better. But if you do want to remove a bit of this excess, and I emphasize remove some of the excess, you can shorten the bodice, so shorten between the bust and the waist here. And make sure you do the same on the back so the side seams match. But please, please, please do not pin a wedge out. Otherwise, this will happen. Same goes for the back pattern piece. So I have to stop the video. I realized post-production I didn't show you one really important thing, and it's a problem that I had on my toile, and something you're likely to come across if you're fitting yourselves or private clients. My front was fine, so I've got a bit of excess here at the waist, which we talked about. I'm happy with that. But on the back, I've got stretch lines going all the way across, and I've got a lot. And you may think, well, this means that it's too tight there. It's actually not. The waistline on my pattern is too long for my back. It's fine on the front, but it's too long in the back. So what do I do when I need to have the front stay the same, but the back needs to be changed, or vice versa? So I'll leave the front as it is, and then I'll shorten the back. But now my side seams aren't the same length between the waist and the underarm. So what do? I just extend the armhole up a bit so it matches the front, and redraw the bottom of the armhole so it reaches this point. Before we fit the bust, I just want to remind you all that our breasts are different sizes, so the right and left will look different. And if you've got a fuller bust, there might be quite a big difference. And it's up to you whether you want to do a custom fit for each side or not. Okay, so if your toile is loose below the bust, try pinning out the excess along the bust dart here. When pinning, pin the excess from the lower dart leg. The top dart leg, in most cases, gives the dart its shape, and we want the dart to stay straight. So keep the top dart leg the same and pin the excess from the lower dart leg. If it's tight under the bust, give more room by repinning the bottom dart leg. So you'll open the dart and then repin the bottom dart leg somewhere in the seam allowance here. When you make the changes to your block or pattern, you'll curve the bottom dart leg more if the under bust was loose, or you'll curve the bottom dart leg less if the under bust was tight. Why am I pinning along the dart? Well, when you're fitting something and you're the one making the pattern changes later on, it's a really good idea to think about what elements are available for you to actually make these fit changes with. So the top hip and the hip here, the only elements I have are this side seam. That's where all the shaping's coming from, which is why I fitted there. And my bust, well, I've only got this one bust dart, so it's best if I make the changes there. Although I could put pins anywhere, if I make the changes here, it's not only easier to make the pattern changes later on, but I'm also testing my changes. This may seem really obvious, but when you're doing fittings, especially with designers, they'll start putting pins randomly anywhere, and you get these samples back with these really unhelpful pin placements, and you have no idea what the original problem was or really how to change your pattern. So if you're at the fitting and you're making the patterns, have a big think about what elements are available to you to fit with and where you can actually make these changes. So I was really hoping with this whole different size patterns I would have one loose bust to show you, but I don't, unfortunately. But if your toile is looking loose over the bust, all we have to do is pin out the excess along the dart leg and pin all the way to the bust point here, which is where the nipple is, and then you just pin the excess up into the shoulder here. So the way you go on the shoulder doesn't matter too much, maybe just go in the middle somewhere. It's just the point that we're going to use to close our pattern. So all we're doing here is really just decreasing the cup size.
Okay, so if your toile is looking tight over the bust and sort of underneath, that means that your bust size is bigger than the pattern. So what you need to do is increase the bust size here. And the easiest way to do that is to unpin your darts and cut into the pattern. So you cut through the dart up to the bust points where the nipple is, and then go all the way to the shoulder here. This is what we call a full bust adjustment, and this is kind of simplified version. Often you can see ones that go not only up here and through the dart, but also go to the center here. So all you're doing is opening it up so that you can add extra fabric in here, and obviously you need a way to record how much you're adding in. So what you do, I'm just half that. You put a piece of fabric underneath. Doesn't need to be the whole way up, just enough to sort of record what you're doing. You just pin the fabric to the toile, and then you just get it to lay flat here so it looks nice, and then just pin the other side. So you can see I'm adding all this extra fabric in here, and then you can just repin the dart so that it sits nicely.
When you make the changes to your pattern or block, you'll need to use the slash and spread technique to decrease or increase the pattern. So, first of all, you draw a slash line from the dart point through the bust point, and then continue the line to somewhere in the middle of the shoulder and cut along it. If decreasing, so you had a smaller bust, you'll need to close the pattern by the same amount of excess you pinned. If increasing, you'll need to open the pattern by the same amount you opened the toile. And when you use the slash and spread technique, you'll see that the shoulder seam gets bent, so you need to straighten that line too. Just do that by drawing a straight line from the neck to the end of the shoulder seam. You'll also need to redraw the dart legs. Remember, the dart should finish about 2 centimeters, which is about 3/4 of an inch, from the bust point, which is on the bust line. This is where the nipple is. If you aren't allowed to, or maybe you don't want to cut into your toile or sample, you still need to make the same pattern adjustments. So maybe instead you could sort of pull the side seam here and see how far it has to move across to give that bust the extra room. Then you could record how far it is from the side seam, so you need to add 2 centimeters. Then you could make a note of that, and then when it comes to do your pattern, you could then spread it by 2 centimeters. Just an idea. And while we're looking at the bust here, let's check that the dart point is finishing at least 2 centimeters from the bust point. So the bust point is where the nipple is, and you want your dart to be finishing at least 2 centimeters away. So we can mark the bust point here and just measure 2 centimeters away. Okay, so we fitted the hip, waist and bust. Now before we move on to the chest and shoulders and armhole, let's have a look at our side seam. Your side seam should sit at the side of your body and should be completely vertical, like mine is. If it's swinging to the back or the front, just unpin the entire side seam and repin it so it's sitting vertically. This can happen because that although your pattern fits your total circumference, your front or back may be bigger or smaller than the pattern. So if the front was bigger, the side seam would sit more to the front, and if the front was smaller, the side seam would sit further to the back. So if you have any issues, the easiest thing to do is just unpin it and then repin it so it's completely vertical, and then you just grab a marker or pen and redraw your new side seam. So we've done the lower part of the bust. Now let's have a look at the chest. What we're going to check here is the across front measurement, which is from the front to about the middle of the armhole, so where the crease in your arm starts. And this is usually about 14 centimeters down from the shoulder neck point here. So you measure 14 centimeters down and then across the body. Often it can be quite hard to find, obviously, your center front when you're measuring your own body. It's much easier when you've got the center front line here on the mannequin. So what you can do is measure the entire across front measurement, then divide in half if your pattern's on the fold or if it's a pair, and then you can get that center front to armhole measurement. So if your across front measurement is too small and you haven't got a sleeve attached, what I'll be doing is the armhole will be sort of pulling across here, and so I've got sort of dipping in. So what you need to do is sort of make a mark where you want the sleeve to sit if you're going to have a sleeve, or where you want the armhole to be. So you have to sort of redraw the armhole here. And if your sleeve is currently attached to your toile, what will be happening is the sleeve there'll be stress lines across the sleeve because it's this is pulling here and the armhole will be moving across there. So what you do, just unpin the seam and move it out a bit to add some extra fabric in there. If your body's across front measurement is smaller than the pattern, there'll be excess along here. So if you haven't got a sleeve, it'll look like the armhole is coming out too far. So you just want to redraw the point where you want the sleeve to sit or where the armhole should be shaped. And if you have got a sleeve attached, there'll be excess along here. And the easy thing to do is just pin out that excess along the seam allowance. When you go to adjust your pattern, if you need to increase the across chest measurement, you'll extend the armhole. And if you want to reduce the measurement, you'll bring the armhole in. You also have to reshape the armhole, but you'll have drawn the new armhole lines on your toile, so you can just copy them across. And if you want to get your French curve and use it to refine your armhole seam, you can do that too. While we're looking at the chest here, now's a good time to look at the bust depth. So that's the distance between the neck and shoulder point here to the bust. And if your body is smaller than the pattern, there'll be gaping across here, so there'll be some excess. And if your body is bigger than the pattern, it'll be stretching, so you need to add some in. So if there's excess, you can pin it out. And remember, we always pin horizontally, the same amount across the piece. And if you've got any excess, if it's looking too tight, you need to slash into it. So cut a slash line all the way across and then spread the pattern. So you put fabric behind it, pin it in place, spread the amount you need, and remember, add the same amount across the whole piece. When you go to adjust your pattern, you will draw a horizontal slash line across the pattern, about 14 centimeters down from the shoulder point. Then, if you need to add length, you'll spread the pattern the same amount as the fabric you added. Or, if you pinned out the excess, you'll overlap the pattern by the same amount you pinned out. This will shorten the pattern. Now I want you to be careful about pinning out the excess here, because while people do have shorter bust depths and people do have concave chests, it's important that they can still be able to move. So even while they could have a concave chest, if they try to reach for something, they still need to have that bit of room there. So don't pin out too much. I would say if you're taking out like 2 or 3 centimeters, you're probably taking out too much. So try and find a balance there. And the other thing to think about is if you're fitting this on you, you're probably like an hour into a fitting, maybe you're getting a bit over it. The posture you'll have while you fit things versus you in a party is very different. And that's the exact same thing for fit models. They've been doing that all day, they're standing around, they're getting bored too. So your fitting posture may be very different from your going out party posture. So keep that in mind.
Okay, so I think we need a break. When you're learning something new, it's really easy to get frustrated. And even when I'm making patterns, I can get into a rut and get frustrated too. So the best thing to do to prevent this is to have a break. And I'm a big fan of the 52-17, I guess it's like a time management theory. So 52 minutes of working, and then 17 minutes having a break. So doing something completely different, whether it's just getting up your chair and grabbing a tea or going outside for a walk. Just give yourself a break so your mind can recharge. And I find a really good amount of time, 52 minutes enough to get something done, but you stop before you get really into a rut or you start getting frustrated by something. It's just a really efficient way to work. And I'll literally set an alarm 52 minutes and then for 17. I do that all day and it's really productive and it really helps me sort of stop before I get frustrated or get stuck into anything and stop enjoying it as well. So that's enough for a break. Let's get back into it.
So I'll get to the armhole and neck in just a second, but let's do the across back measurement first. So the across back is quite similar to the across chest. It's just a measurement across the body, about 14 centimeters down from the shoulder neck point here. And you just measure across the body. Once again, it's kind of hard to find your center back unless you've got a zip happening there. So measure the whole body and divide it by 2 if your pattern's a pair. and you'll need someone to help you do this, and you'll also need someone to help you fit your back, so obviously you can't reach it. But if you're getting someone who doesn't have a lot of pattern cutting or fitting experience or sewing experience, make sure they don't overpin. You need to be able to move. So while they're making adjustments, make sure that you can still move. So move your arms, hunch your shoulders a bit, make sure they don't overpin. So say with the across chest measurement, you'll know if your across back is tight, so if your body is bigger than the pattern, because the armhole will be a bit distorted, it'll be coming in too far. So you just need to mark that new point in the seam allowance. And if your sleeve is attached, it'll be pulling the bottom of the sleeve cap there, so there'll be a tightness there. So just unpin the armhole seam and reposition it so the fabric is nice and smooth and flat. And if your body is smaller than the pattern measurements, the armhole will be sort of falling off a bit here, so you need to reshape it. So you'll bring the across back measurement in. And same with the sleeve. So if the sleeve looks like it's gaping or there's excess around the armhole, just pin that out along your armhole seam. When you make these adjustments on your pattern, you'll bring the armhole in to reduce the across back measurement. If you need to increase the back measurement, you'll extend the armhole out, like we did for the across chest measurement. Then reshape the armhole using the line you drew on your toile, or you can reshape it using the French curve. So that's how you would add it or change it at the armhole. But if you've got a centre back seam, you can also make adjustments here. So if it's looking a bit tight, especially if there's stretch lines towards the centre here, you can just unpin the seam a bit to give a bit more fabric. If it's looking loose, you can just bring that seam in and repin it so it's a bit tighter. When you go to adjust your pattern, to reduce the measurement, see how much excess you pinned on your toile and bring in the centre back seam by the same amount. Be careful not to reduce it too much though. I'd say max 0.75 centimetres, just depends on your pattern as well. The across back measurement should be the widest point on the upper back, so don't create a dip. If you need to increase the across back measurement, bring the centre back seam out by the same amount as your toile. Don't add too much though, you don't want to create a hunchback. And while we're here, let's have a look at the across back depth. So same as the bust depth, if there's a lot of gaping across a lot of excess across the back here, it means your sort of back measurement is shorter than what's on the pattern. So you just pin that excess out horizontally across the piece. But if your body is longer than the pattern, it'll be sort of tight and pulling, so these stretch lines kind of go like this. So what you want to do, get your scissors, cut a horizontal line, and make both these adjustments sort of near the across back measurement, so sort of 14 centimetres down. It's just a nice point to make adjustments because it's pretty straight here at the armhole. So you cut all the way across and then spread the pattern, put some fabric behind, pin it in place, and then spread it so it sits nicely, and then pin the top edge there. So you're just adding fabric in, adding the same amount across the piece. Okay, so now that our across back and across chest are looking really good, let's have a look at the neck. So the neck should be sitting really nice and flat across the body. It does need to have a tiny bit of ease, so it has about 3 mils, which is about 1/8 of an inch of ease, but you shouldn't really see this. It's just something you'll notice when you put it on. It shouldn't be tight, it shouldn't be digging into your body. So just make sure this neckline's sitting really flat. And you see here, mine's got a bit of gaping. So what I'll do is unpin the nearest seam, which is my shoulder seam, and then I'm just going to smooth that fabric into the shoulder seam there. So it's sitting nice and flat now, and you can see here that this is where the shoulder seam on the back finishes. This is where the shoulder seam on the front finishes. So obviously I'm going to need to blend those 2 points. The important thing for now is that both my necklines are sitting really flat and nice, and that my shoulder seam is looking really good. And what I'll do is I'll just mark a notch on both sides of the shoulder seam. I'm not going to bother redrawing the neckline now because just fiddly putting extra fabric in there. I'll just sort of mark the point where I want the front to start joining up with the back because yeah, I haven't changed the back neck, so that's the one that's correct. So I've just the front, so I want to, when I create my pattern, I want to blend this line all the way up to the original shoulder seam there. And if your neck was looking tight, you do the same thing. So you'd unpin the shoulder seam, but what you do, rather than smoothing the fabric out to remove excess, you'd add some fabric in, and then you'd repin the shoulder seam in the right place and put a notch on either side. Now, if you've got a really low neckline, say like a V neckline, there may be some gaping along the edge here, maybe it hasn't been contoured enough. So what you do is you just pin out that excess towards your bust point, not the dart point. I will show you how to transfer excess to the dart when we get to the armhole section, but for now, I just want you to pin out the excess. So starting at, say the V's down there, you start at a point on the neckline and pin right to the dart, the bust point that you've marked. Bust point, not dart point. And I'll show you how to pivot that out in a second. Now let's have a look at the shoulder seam here. And we're going to look at two things, the shoulder angle and the shoulder seam length. So we'll look at the shoulder angle first. So if your shoulder seam is loose or tight at any point along here, it means your shoulder angle is different from the one in the pattern, and that's quite normal. So the easy way to fix this is to just unpin the shoulder seam and then just make sure the fabric is nice and smooth, and then just repin it so that it fits your shoulder perfectly. And when you do this, your shoulder seam notches probably won't be matching anymore, which is completely fine. All you have to do is mark new ones, but please remember to mark your shoulder seam notches. They are really important. If it's just loose or tight on one side or location, for example the back neck, you just need to pin the excess or add some fabric at that point. Now let's check the shoulder length. So the sleeve should sit at the top of the shoulder here, so where the arm bone is. And if you move your hand, your arm up and down, you can feel the shoulder socket there. So if you're like me and fitting a sleeve afterwards, you can just mark that point where the arm socket is, so where you want your sleeve to sit at the top of the shoulder there. If your sleeve is attached and your shoulder length is longer than the pattern, you'll notice that the sleeve is pulling because it's being stretched there. So what you need to do is just unpin the armhole seam and reposition the sleeve so it's further out. So it'll be positioned somewhere in the seam allowance now. Or you might need to add a scrap of fabric if you need to make really big changes. So add a scrap of fabric and then you can pin the sleeve onto that. If your shoulder length is shorter than the pattern, it'll be loose and gaping here. So you can just pin out that excess along the armhole and that will move the sleeve in. When you make your pattern adjustments, if you want to reduce the shoulder length, just bring the armhole in. If you want to increase the shoulder length, you'll bring the armhole out along the shoulder seam. Okay, so the top of the front and back pattern should be looking pretty good now. So let's have a look at the armhole. So there shouldn't be any stretch lines or gaping on the armhole, but there should be some ease in certain locations if your pattern has a sleeve. To properly examine the armhole, let's look at it in sections. So on the top half of the front and back of the armhole should be sitting smooth and flat against the body. If there's any gaping, just release the shoulder seam here and smooth the fabric into it. If it's a bit tight, get some more fabric, unpin the shoulder seam and just add some more fabric in. If you have adjusted your shoulder angle, you may have resolved these issues already. Now let's look at the base. On the front of the armhole, so in the bottom section here, there should be about 6 mils. I think that's 1/4 inch of ease if you have a sleeve. However, if you don't have a sleeve, this section should be completely flat. So no sleeve, no ease. Same on the back. If your pattern does have a sleeve, you need about 1.8 centimeters of ease, which I think is about 3/4 inch. However, if you don't have a sleeve, you do not need any ease. So it should be completely flat along the whole armhole if you do not have sleeves. So keeping those ease measurements in mind, let's have a look at the back, because it's a bit easy to do. If it's gaping, so got excess of greater than 1.9 centimeters, unpin the side seam and smooth the extra excess into the side seam. So essentially you're changing the angle of the side seam, and you may need to redraw the armhole here so that it matches the front. If your back armhole is looking a bit tight, you once again unpin the side seam here and just add a bit more fabric in. So once again, you're changing the side seam angle and you need to redraw the armhole on the back here so that it meets the front. When you come to adjust your pattern, if you had too much ease, you'll decrease the armhole at the underarm seam. If your armhole was too tight and you need to add more in, just increase the armhole at the underarm. And make sure you blend these new points with the surrounding seams too. So on the front here, if your pattern doesn't have any darts, you have to do the same thing that we did on the back. So you need to add some in, unpin the seams and add some fabric in and repin the side seam. You need to remove some excess, unpin the side seam, smooth it out, and then repin the seam. So in both ways, you're changing the side seam angle to either add or subtract fabric to the front. But if your pattern has a dart, you can either move that excess into the dart, or if the armhole is tight, you can get the extra room by making the bust dart smaller. Let me show you. If your front armhole is gaping more than 6 millimeters, pin out the excess. And when you pin, make sure it's in the direction of the bust point here. So bust point, not dart point. You just want to pin along here, and it will get, so you can see it's getting pretty much close to nothing there. But the important thing is that you get the right amount at the armhole here, so you know how much you need to take off at the armhole, and what your excess you're removing is in the right direction, so it's going to hit the dart point there, bust point there. However, if the armhole is too tight and you need to add fabric in, what you can do is just cut from the armhole here, so it's got a curved bit here, cut a diagonal line headed towards the bust point, and then stick a bit of fabric behind it, and I don't need to do this because my armhole, I've kind of messed it up now by doing that slash and spread technique, but my armhole was looking okay. But say you need to add it in, you just spread it to the desired amount and pin that fabric in place. And make sure you spend some time getting the pinning right. This will tell you how much you need to add when you create the pattern. So if the armhole wasn't looking right, you either removed excess by pinning it out a little bit, or you added some in using the slash and spread technique. So either way, your toile is looking accurate. So when you go to create your pattern, what you'll do is use a slash and spread technique to either reduce the dart and add some up here, or add this excess down to the dart. And I'll show you how to do this in 1 second. And remember how if you had a V-neck, how you may have had to pin out some excess here to contour it properly. You can do the same thing, same slash and spread technique with the excess you pinned out here. So when you come to adjust your pattern, what you'll do is draw a slash line from the armhole to the bust point, and then another slash line from the dart point to the bust point. Then cut along both these lines, finishing just before the bust point. To reduce the armhole, you'll overlap the pattern by the same amount as you pinned out on your toile. So if you pinned out 1 centimeter at the armhole, overlap it by 1 centimeter. See how the bust dart is now bigger? To increase the armhole, you will spread the slash line by the same amount as you opened your toile. See how the bust dart has gotten smaller? Be careful how much you add though. If your dart legs are getting really close, you may need to add some this way and then add some at the side seam. And if you aren't feeling confident about moving darts around, or maybe your pattern is a bit complicated, just adjust the armhole at the side seam. Okay, so the armhole is done, and mine's looking like a bit of a hot mess because I've done all these things that I didn't actually need to do. But if you have added or changed the armhole here, maybe you got rid of some excess or you added a bit of fabric in, make sure you're happy with the shape. You can adjust the shape when you look at your pattern later on, but just make sure that you've marked your cross back and your cross chest measurements, so you know that when you position your sleeve, it's going to be in the right points. And make sure you marked your correct shoulder length, so where that shoulder bone is kind of sitting there. If you have your shoulder length, your across chest and across back, and you know where you want your armhole to finish. And yeah, before you add your sleeve, maybe it's a good time to think about your armhole. For a fitted dress, I do about 2 centimeters above the bust line, which is a bit hard to see on toile obviously, but if you're thinking the armhole is kind of digging into your body, you want to drop it down, now's a good time to look at that. So before you add your sleeve in, take some time to make sure you're happy with the armhole shape. Hopefully your pattern you used a pretty good block or pattern anyway, so the armhole shape should be looking pretty good, so you can use that as a reference. But if you want to drop the armhole, just bring it down. You won't want to change the measurements here. Maybe a little bit back because the back's looking more accurate. So if you want to drop it down, maybe 1 centimeter or so. This is my seam allowance. So this is my seam, not my seam allowance. So say you're dropping it down here, you just create a nice curved line. You kind of want the underarm, the sides in here to be sort of not straight, but just sort of level out here. You want a sort of a 90-degree angle at the side seam and armhole, so it looks quite nice. So yeah, make sure you're happy with your armhole shape before you add your sleeve, and just check those shoulder seam length, across front, across back, and make sure you're happy with where the underarm is. Okay, so the final part is the sleeve, and before you put your sleeve on, or even before you cut in calico, it can be a good idea to measure your bicep measurement. Especially if your sleeve is fitted, you want to make sure that it can get over your bicep, and make sure that you include some ease. How much ease you add is up to you, your design and fabric, and how much you want to be able to move in your sleeve. Once you have your bicep plus ease measurement, measure your underarm line. This is about where your bicep will be. If it's too small, you'll need to lengthen it. This isn't just as simple as extending the line though, as that will make the sleeve bigger than the armhole. So you need to reduce the cap height, which will change the curves of the sleeve head. So you'll need to redraft the sleeve a bit. I know, sleeves are kind of terrifying, but the good thing is I've done a whole drafting video on how to create sleeves, not just fitted ones, so lots of different types of sleeves, from really fitted to oversized. So watch it and give it a go. You might be surprised by how much you can actually achieve. And to be honest, if you have made major changes to your armhole, like your shoulder angle was really different, or you had a lot of excess in places, if you've made major changes, you might be better off just starting your sleeve again. And if you are worried about drafting a sleeve, remember you can always use the original pattern. You can get the shape from there as well, so you can use it as a reference. Just give it a go. And remember, you can always fit, well, we are going to fit a sleeve toile here now, so there's always time to fit things and test things. Now, before we start fitting, there's a couple other flat pattern making changes that you might want to make before. If you've made changes to the top half of the sleeve, perhaps it was loose or tight, or you need to change the angle of the shoulder, you'll need to change the top of the sleeve head. If you increase the armhole, increase the sleeve head so it matches the armhole length. If you decrease the armhole, decrease the sleeve head. If you make changes to the bottom half of the armhole, you'll need to change the bottom of the sleeve head by increasing or decreasing the sleeve along the underarm line. This is different to adjusting it for the bicep, because you aren't just adding extra length to fit your bicep, you're actually changing the sleeve so it matches the changes you already made to the armhole. So measure the armhole on your toile and see how much you need to increase or decrease the underarm line by. And doing these basic sleeve adjustments now will give you a really good starting point to ensure your sleeve actually fits the armhole. Then, cut it in calico and attach it to your toile. Now let's have a look at the sleeve. And I've pinned mine onto my other armhole because this one is now a bit of a hot mess. And what I like to do when I'm fitting sleeves is I like to put them at the angle that they were made for. And there's more information on this in my sleeve drafting video. But essentially, sleeves are made to sit at a certain angle to the arm. And so fitted sleeves are designed to sit very close to the body, while oversized ones are meant to sit further out. So in order to see what's really going on, I like to move the arm so it's at the angle that the sleeve was made for. So you just want to get the right point there where it's not buckling at the top here and it's not sort of gaping and really loose at the underarm. So this sleeve is made to sort of sit, see how it's gaping? That's where I want to fit it. So let's look at the sleeve head first. So what we're looking for is the same things that we're looking for on the body. So we're looking for areas where it's tight and pulling, so there's sort of stretch lines, or we're looking for gaping and excess. So if you look at the sleeve head here, if it's tight and pulling, what you do is you just open the seam, pull the arm down, and then repin the seam so that the sleeve head seam would now be somewhere in the old seam allowance. And if you need to add more fabric in, you can just pin a piece of fabric along the edge here. But if it was too much excess, I could add a little bit more in here, I think. So just unpin the seam, shift it down. If there was a lot of excess, so I think I've got probably a bit too much excess in here. If my armhole seam was sewn, I could just pin out the excess here. But since mine's pinned, I can just simply unpin the seam and just pin out the excess, or move the seam so that it's getting rid of that excess there. And that's actually looking pretty good. So yeah, and then you can start looking at the body. Make sure you're happy with the length and the sleeve hem circumference. Can you move well? If it's feeling a bit tight through the body here, increase the circumference. So you can just pin mine to the toile so it looks a bit nicer. You can just unpin that underarm seam here and just repin it so the circumference is bigger. Remember the underarm seam should always be symmetrical, so make sure you make the same changes to both sides of the sleeve. So, if you've just watched this full video, you may be feeling slightly overwhelmed. Don't worry, just take your time. And remember, those perfectly fitted samples you see walking down the runway, they are custom made to each model's body measurements, not the designer's sample size. And they are fitted for days leading up to the show by very skilled pattern cutters and machinists. I should also mention that a studio's blocks are refined over numerous fittings, even seasons. It takes time to make a good pattern, even if you're a professional. Okay, and we're done. So now you have to mark all your changes, and it's important you mark everything. So any seams you change, any necklines, shoulder seam, side seam, any changes to the dart, mark any excess you pinned out, especially the excess. So any excess removed, anything added in, any seams changed, mark everything. And it's best to use a thin pen to do this, or thin marker, so it's really accurate. And remember that every seam should have a notch. So if you haven't changed the seams or the dart, there'll be notches already, so don't worry. But if you have changed the seam, so I changed my shoulder seam, it's important that you add a new shoulder notch to both sides. So I've drawn on the front and I've got matching on my back. The shoulder notch is actually a really important one because once you have that point, you can then redraft your neckline and armhole on the pattern, and just makes it a lot easier to make sure you've got the right, because if you get that notch wrong by even a tiny bit, the whole front and back will shift. So shoulder notch is an important one, don't forget that one. And also mark, it's good to get in the practice of marking your bust line, waistline, hip line. Even if you just do one, try and do your waistline. It's just good to have reference on your pattern so that when you're making, adding design features or making any changes, you know where those lines are. Okay, and once you've made all your markings and you've made sure you've marked everything, you can then remove your toile and lay on top of your pattern. And then you just get a tracing wheel and trace over all the new lines and notches. Then you can remove the toile and draw over those lines and notches. So once you've adjusted all your patterns and you've checked all the seam angles looking good, so they're all kind of 90 degrees where they should be, you can then true your seams. And we did that when we were custom grading our block. So essentially it just means walking one joining seam over the top of each other and making sure they're the same distance and all the notches match. Unless the area is stretched, like the bottom of the dart leg, or has ease, like top of the sleeve head. But otherwise, all your seams, all the joining seams should be the same length and the notches should match. And once you've trued your seams, you can then add your seam allowances. If you're still not sure you've got the right fit, then maybe you can re-toile it. Or if you want to go into a sample and you just want to have the confidence to, or flexibility to be able to fit a couple of things, add the 2 cm seam allowances again. This will give you more room to fit. So yeah, keep the 2 cm seam allowances on the side seam and on the back. And actually when you're doing clothing for clients or even for the runway shows, you will have that extra seam allowance in, because if someone spends $10,000 on a dress, they want the ability to come back and get that refitted. if they change sizes. So it's not uncommon to have big seam allowances. Okay, so we've covered a lot, and yes, fitting does take time. However, it is so worth the investment, especially if you're making a block custom made to your measurements. Once you have that block and it fits you really well, it'll make it so much easier for you to create patterns and will involve less fitting of your patterns later on. However, I will say that starting from a good block will make your life so much easier, and you can purchase all the ones I perfected over my career on my website, clickedpatternkits.com. However, there is nothing better than bringing your own designs to life, and I started this YouTube channel to share the pattern cutting skills I developed over my career to help you do the same. So follow my channel and let me know what you want to see in the comments. I do read them, I do respond to them, and they do help me decide what content I'm going to create. In fact, this video was requested by someone who wants to buy the block that I used for the demonstration, and they wanted to make sure that they knew how to fit it properly. So now we have the video. So yeah, let me know what you want to see and follow my channel for more pattern cutting videos.